We often assume that understanding stress, anxiety, and emotional regulation is a modern achievement. We talk about the nervous system, vagus nerve, and fight-or-flight responses as if these are recent discoveries. Yet thousands of years ago, certain traditions were already developing sophisticated ways of working with the human nervous system without ever using those words. The Stoics were among the clearest thinkers on this subject. They understood something fundamental, that suffering often comes not from events themselves, but how our minds and bodies react to those events. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca repeatedly wrote about the importance of distinguishing between what happens and how we respond to it. This distinction is remarkably close to what we now understand about nervous system regulation. When the nervous system is in a reactive state, it narrows our perception. We become more rigid in our thinking, more defensive in our responses, and less able to see clearly. The Stoics observed this pattern in themselves and others. They noticed that when people felt threatened, whether by loss, criticism, or uncertainty, they tended to contract, both mentally and physically. Their recommended practices, such as negative visualization, voluntary discomfort, and daily reflection, were essentially methods for training the nervous system to remain steady even when circumstances were difficult. What makes Stoic wisdom particularly relevant today is that they treated emotional regulation as a skill that could be developed through practice, not as a fixed personality trait. They understood that the ability to stay calm under pressure was something a person could cultivate over time through repeated small actions. This aligns closely with what modern neuroscience tells us about neuroplasticity and the nervous system's capacity to change with consistent input. In this chapter, we've laid the foundation by recognizing that ancient traditions were already working with the same core challenge we face today: how to keep the nervous system from becoming chronically reactive in an uncertain world. In the next chapter, we'll explore how ancient yogic traditions approached the same problem from a different but equally sophisticated angle, focusing on the body as the primary doorway to regulation.
Building on what we explored about the Stoics, we now turn to another ancient tradition that developed remarkably precise methods for working with the nervous system, the yogic traditions of India. While the Stoics approached regulation primarily through thought and perspective, the Yogis approached it primarily through the body and breath. They observed something that modern science has only recently begun to confirm in detail: that the state of the nervous system can be directly influenced through conscious breathing and specific physical postures. The Yogis noticed that when the breath is rapid, shallow, or irregular, the mind tends to become agitated. When the breath is slow, deep, and steady, the mind tends to become calmer. This observation led to the development of pranayama, breath regulation practices, as one of the central pillars of yoga. These were not spiritual rituals alone. They were practical technologies for shifting the nervous system out of reactive states and into states of greater clarity and stability. What is particularly striking is how precisely these ancient practitioners mapped the effects of different breathing patterns. Long, slow exhales were understood to calm the system. Certain breath retentions were used to build resilience and focus. The Yogis were essentially conducting sophisticated experiments on their own nervous systems thousands of years before we had the language of the autonomic nervous system or the vagus nerve. They also recognized that posture affects mental and emotional states. The practice of asana, physical postures, was developed in part to create a stable, steady physical foundation from which the nervous system could more easily settle. A body that is chronically tense or collapsed sends constant signals of threat or defeat to the nervous system. By systematically working with posture, the Yogis were addressing the nervous system through the body. This body-first approach complements the Stoic emphasis on perspective.
Where the Stoics taught us to question our interpretations of events, the Yogis taught us to work directly with the physiological state that makes those interpretations feel so convincing in the first place. Both approaches are valuable. We will now explore one of the oldest recorded texts on these themes, the Rig Veda, and what it reveals about the ancient understanding of inner order and stillness.
The Rig Veda is one of humanity's oldest spiritual and philosophical texts. Composed over 3,000 years ago, it contains some of the earliest recorded reflections on the human condition, including the search for inner stability amidst external chaos. While it is primarily known as a collection of hymns, it also contains profound insights into the nature of mind, perception, and the cultivation of inner order. One of the recurring themes in the Rig Veda is the contrast between chaos and order, both in the cosmos and within the individual. The text suggests that human beings have a deep need for inner structure and stability, and that this stability is not something that happens automatically. It must be cultivated through attention, discipline, and alignment with deeper principles. The Rig Veda speaks of Urta, the cosmic order that underlies all things. It suggests that when human beings live in alignment with this order, they experience greater harmony and steadiness. When they fall out of alignment, they experience agitation, confusion, and suffering. This idea is remarkably close to modern understandings of nervous system regulation. When our internal state is aligned with safety and coherence, we experience calm and clarity. When our system is out of alignment with safety, due to chronic stress, trauma, or overstimulation, we experience the opposite. The text also emphasizes the importance of stillness and quiet observation as pathways to understanding. It does not promote constant activity or endless striving. Instead, it points toward moments of deep stillness as essential for gaining perspective and restoring inner balance. This aligns closely with what we now know about the nervous system's need for genuine rest and recovery states in order to function well over time. The Rig Veda reminds us that the search for calm and inner order is not a new human concern. It has been a central preoccupation of thoughtful people for thousands of years. What the ancient seers understood intuitively, we are now beginning to understand through the lens of neuroscience and physiology.
Building directly on the theme of inner order introduced in the Rig Veda, we now turn to one of the most psychologically sophisticated texts in human history, the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita presents a conversation between Arjuna, a warrior facing an impossible moral and emotional crisis, and Krishna, who serves as his guide. What makes the Gita remarkable is not just its spiritual depth, but its practical understanding of how to maintain steadiness when everything feels overwhelming. Krishna repeatedly emphasizes the importance of equanimity, the ability to remain steady whether one faces success or failure, pleasure or pain, gain or loss. This is not presented as a distant spiritual ideal, but as a practical necessity for effective action in difficult circumstances. The text suggests that when the mind is tossed about by constantly changing circumstances and emotions, clear judgment becomes impossible. From a nervous system perspective, the Gita is describing what happens when we lose access to regulated states. When the nervous system is highly activated or dysregulated, our thinking becomes narrow, reactive, and often distorted. We lose the capacity for perspective. The Gita's solution is not to suppress emotion or detach from life, but to cultivate an inner anchor, a steady center from which one can act without being thrown off balance by every changing condition. One of the most practical teachings in the Gita is the emphasis on focusing on action rather than the fruits of action. This is not about becoming indifferent to outcomes. It is about freeing the nervous system from the constant anxiety of attachment to results. When we are overly identified with specific outcomes, our nervous system remains in a state of chronic tension and vigilance. By shifting attention to the quality of our action in the present moment, we give the system permission to settle. The Gita also offers guidance on how to work with difficult emotions without being consumed by them. It acknowledges that fear, anger, and grief are natural human experiences, but it teaches that these states do not have to control our actions or define our identity. This is remarkably aligned with modern approaches to emotional regulation that emphasize awareness and acceptance rather than suppression or reactivity.
Continuing from the Bhagavad Gita's emphasis on equanimity, we now turn to see how Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoic emperors, applied similar principles in his own life under even more extreme circumstances, ruling the Roman Empire during a time of war, plague, and political instability. Marcus Aurelius wrote his personal reflections, later known as meditations, during military campaigns and amidst constant pressure. What is striking about his writing is how consistently he returns to the same core insight, that our suffering is largely determined by our judgments about events, not by the events themselves. This is not a denial of real difficulties. Marcus Aurelius faced very real and serious problems: betrayal, loss, public criticism, and the constant threat of death. Yet he repeatedly observed that the way he interpreted these events determined whether they broke him or strengthened him. This is one of the clearest ancient descriptions of what we now understand as the relationship between perception, nervous system state, and emotional resilience. When the nervous system is highly reactive, it tends to interpret neutral or ambiguous situations as threatening. Small setbacks feel catastrophic. Criticism feels like an attack on our entire being. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to question these automatic interpretations. He practiced seeing events from a wider perspective, asking whether something would matter in a year, or 10 years, or 100 years. This practice of widening perspective is remarkably effective at downregulating the nervous system's threat response. He also emphasized the importance of accepting what cannot be changed, while focusing energy on what can be influenced. This acceptance is not passive resignation. It is a strategic decision that prevents the nervous system from remaining in a state of chronic resistance and frustration. Chronic resistance to reality is one of the most exhausting things the nervous system can do. Marcus Aurelius's writings remind us that the capacity to stay steady is not reserved for monks or philosophers. It was practiced by someone who carried enormous responsibility under extremely difficult conditions. His example suggests that these skills are not luxuries. They are essential tools for anyone who wants to remain effective and humane in challenging circumstances.
Building on Marcus Aurelius's emphasis on perspective and steady attention, we now explore one of the most relevant ancient teachings for our current moment, the Buddhist concept of right attention or right mindfulness. In Buddhist psychology, right attention is one of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. It refers to the cultivation of clear, present moment awareness without being pulled into reactivity or judgment. While this sounds simple, it is actually one of the most powerful tools available for nervous system regulation, especially in an age of constant distraction and overstimulation. Modern life bombards the nervous system with more information and stimulation than it evolved to handle. Notifications, news, social media, and endless content create a state of chronic low-level activation. The nervous system remains on alert, scanning for the next piece of information or potential threat. Over time, this exhausts our capacity for deep focus, emotional regulation, and genuine rest. The practice of right attention offers a direct counter to this pattern. By intentionally bringing attention to the present moment, whether through breath, body sensations, or simple awareness of what is happening right now, we give the nervous system permission to step out of scanning mode. We stop feeding the cycle of reactivity. What makes this practice particularly powerful is that it does not require us to change our external circumstances. We do not need to escape to a monastery or eliminate all stimulation from our lives. We simply need to practice returning attention to what is actually happening in the present moment again and again. Each time we do this, we strengthen the nervous system's capacity to settle. The Buddha taught that much of our suffering comes from being lost in thoughts about the past or future, or in reactive patterns that we do not even notice. By cultivating clear attention, we begin to see these patterns more clearly. This seeing itself has a regulating effect. When we can observe our own reactivity without immediately being pulled into it, the nervous system has space to down-regulate.
We now turn to one of the most practical and universally accessible tools emphasized across ancient traditions, the breath, one of the most direct bridges between body and mind for achieving this kind of regulation. Virtually every major contemplative tradition, from yoga to Buddhism to certain Stoic and Christian practices, recognized the breath as a direct pathway for influencing mental and emotional states. This was not mystical speculation. It was careful observation of a basic physiological reality, that the breath and the nervous system are intimately connected. When we are in a reactive or stressed state, the breath tends to become faster, shallower, and more irregular. When we are in a regulated state, the breath tends to be slower, deeper, and more rhythmic. By consciously working with the breath, ancient practitioners discovered they could influence the nervous system in the opposite direction, using slow, steady breathing to signal safety to the body. The yogic traditions developed particularly sophisticated breath practices, as we discussed earlier, but the fundamental insight appears across many cultures. Changing how we breathe changes how we feel. This works because the breath is one of the few autonomic functions that can be consciously controlled. By voluntarily slowing and deepening the breath, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system and send a direct signal of safety to the brain. Modern research has confirmed what ancient traditions observed. Slow breathing, especially with longer exhales, reliably down-regulates the nervous system. It reduces heart rate, lowers blood pressure, and decreases activity in brain regions associated with threat detection. These effects happen relatively quickly, which is why breath practices have remained central to regulation traditions for thousands of years. What the ancients understood intuitively and what we are now rediscovering scientifically is that the breath is not just a background process, it is a powerful lever for shifting our internal state. In moments of stress or reactivity, returning attention to the breath and consciously slowing it can interrupt the cycle of nervous system activation before it escalates.
Building on the practical tools of breath and attention, we now explore a deeper theme that runs through many ancient traditions, the understanding of discipline as an expression of self-respect rather than self-punishment. In modern culture, discipline is often associated with forcing ourselves to do difficult things through sheer willpower. Ancient traditions tended to view it differently. They saw discipline as the cultivation of habits and ways of being that allow a person to live in greater alignment with their deeper values and with reality itself. From a nervous system perspective, this distinction is important. When discipline is driven by harsh self-criticism or the belief that we are fundamentally inadequate, it often creates additional stress.
The nervous system remains in a state of chronic tension because we are constantly at war with ourselves. This is exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Ancient teachers across traditions emphasized a different motivation for discipline. They suggested that certain practices, whether meditation, ethical conduct, physical training, or study, were worth maintaining because they supported the kind of life a person actually wanted to live. Discipline, in this view, was an act of self-respect. It was a way of honoring one's own capacity for clarity, steadiness, and contribution. This perspective changes the nervous system's relationship to practice. Instead of approaching discipline as something we must force ourselves to do, we approach it as something that helps us become more ourselves. The practices become less about achieving an external ideal and more about removing the obstacles that prevent us from living with greater clarity and calm. The Stoics spoke of living in accordance with nature, meaning living in alignment with how human beings actually function well. The Yogis spoke of practices that purify and steady the system so that higher states of awareness become accessible. In both cases, discipline was understood as supportive rather than punitive. This does not mean discipline is always easy or pleasant. It often requires doing things that are uncomfortable in the short term. But the motivation comes from a different place, from care for one's own long-term well-being, rather than from self-rejection.
Continuing from our discussion of discipline, we now explore a countercultural practice that many ancient traditions considered essential, yet which modern culture often treats with suspicion or guilt: the practice of doing nothing. In many contemplative traditions, periods of intentional stillness and non-doing were not seen as laziness or wasted time. They were understood as necessary for the nervous system to integrate experiences, restore energy, and return to a state of natural clarity. The constant pressure to be productive or entertained was recognized as something that could exhaust the system and cloud perception. The Stoics valued time alone with one's thoughts. The Yogis and Buddhists emphasized meditation, which at its core involves sitting with what is, without constantly trying to change it or escape it. Even in more active traditions, there was often an understanding that rest and stillness were not indulgences, but necessities for long-term effectiveness and wisdom. From a nervous system perspective, this makes perfect sense. The nervous system needs time in restorative states in order to function well. Chronic activation without adequate recovery leads to burnout, reactivity, and diminished capacity. When we fill every moment with activity, stimulation, or distraction, we deprive the system of the conditions it needs to return to baseline. The ancient emphasis on doing nothing was not about becoming passive or unproductive. It was about recognizing that human beings are not machines that can operate at full capacity indefinitely. We need rhythm, periods of engagement, and periods of rest. The wisdom traditions understood this rhythm as essential for both effectiveness and well-being. In our current culture, the ability to do nothing without immediately reaching for a phone or some other distraction has become surprisingly rare. Yet this capacity may be more important than ever. When we cannot tolerate stillness, we often remain in low-level states of activation without realizing it. The simple practice of sitting quietly, without agenda, can be profoundly regulating for the nervous system.
Throughout this series, we have explored how ancient traditions approached the challenge of staying steady in difficult circumstances. We have seen that the Stoics, Yogis, Vedic seers, and Buddhist teachers developed sophisticated understandings of what we now call nervous system regulation, long before we had scientific language for it. What is striking is how much these ancient approaches have in common with what modern neuroscience is now discovering: the value of slow breathing, the importance of perspective, the need for genuine rest, the power of attention and the recognition that suffering often comes from our reactions rather than from events themselves, these insights appear across traditions separated by thousands of years and vast cultural differences. At the same time, we have gained significant advantages in the modern era. We have access to better nutrition, medical care, physical safety, and scientific understanding than any previous generation. We have tools for tracking our physiology, understanding trauma, and addressing mental health challenges that ancient people did not possess. These are genuine advances. Yet something has also been lost. Many ancient traditions emphasized rhythm, rest, and periods of genuine non-doing as essential for human flourishing. They understood the nervous system's need for safety and recovery in ways that our always-on culture often neglects. They treated the cultivation of inner steadiness as a central life task, not as an optional self-improvement project. Perhaps the most valuable thing we can take from these ancient roots is the recognition that calm is not something we achieve once and then maintain forever. It is something we return to again and again through practices that signal safety to the nervous system. The ancients understood that this return is not a sign of weakness. It is simply how human beings stay well over the long term. As we conclude this pillar on the ancient roots of modern calm, I invite you to reflect on which of these old insights feel most relevant to your own life right now. Which practices or perspectives might be worth exploring more deeply? Thank you for staying till the end on this journey through ancient wisdom and its relevance to nervous system regulation today. If this video helped you see things a little more clearly, or if something resonated with you, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel. See you in the next one.